welcome to everybody. My name's Alice Roberts. I'm Head of Campaigns at CPRE London, but I'm also the coordinator of the Healthy Street Scorecard Coalition. We're a coalition of transport, environment and other related charities and campaign groups from across London concerned with transport and environment issues. And we came together in 2018 to create the Healthy Street Scorecard. I'll talk about that in a moment. So we're very excited today to be launching the 2021 Healthy Street Scorecard, and we've also extremely pleased that we have politicians from across the political parties to talk about their take on the scorecard results today. So that's fantastic. So the event format is just that I will give you a quick bit of background, and then Simon Monk, who represents London Cycling Campaign, which is one of the organisations in our coalition, is going to present the results on behalf of the coalition. And then we're going to have various councillors from across councillors and London Assembly members, sorry, I should say, from across London and the political parties to give their take, and then we'll have a bit of time for questions. So if you do have questions, please put them into the chat, and then Jeremy Leach, who is from London Living Streets, another member of our coalition, will field the questions, try to field them in the chat if possible, and will ask the questions at the end. We'll choose questions to ask a panel at the end. So just a quick bit of background. We came together in 2018, just after the Mayor's Transport Strategy had been published, and that we knew that was a major opportunity because it said that had a major target within it to reduce car trips and increase sustainable travel, and we all had certain issues. So whether that was cycling, or whether it was about road casualties and road deaths, or whether it was about noise from transport, or about the need for more active travel, we all knew that the answers to those issues were all in the same actions. We all wanted councils to be doing the same things. So there was a huge opportunity, and we felt that we really needed to get together to promote action on certain interventions, if you like, that councils could take. And we felt that we should promote a limited number of interventions, and interventions which we felt would be achievable and affordable, and that those were things that councils could do right away, and which would make a big difference if they did them. So we came up with 4 interventions, which were to low traffic neighbourhoods, protected cycle track, 20-mile-per-hour speed limits, and controlled parking. And so we decided that to promote action and to enable boroughs to identify areas for action, we would publish the scorecard. And we did that for the first time in 2019. We did it so again last year, and this is the third year. So the coalition has grown since 2018. We now have 8 members, and most recently we've welcomed Possible, Climate Campaigners, and Wheels for Wellbeing. And so we also have a huge network of local campaigners now, which has grown, which we've developed over the last year. We're now connected to around 300, more than 300 local campaign groups and campaigners. And most recently, we have gained the official support of the British Lung Foundation and Asthma UK, which is very exciting for us. So I'd just like to finish by saying a huge thanks to the coalition members and the individuals, and to thank the councillors and the local authorities out there, the councillors who are here today, but also the councillors and the local authorities who are out there taking action, to all of the individual campaigners who are spending their time and their volunteer time promoting action as well, and to all of you for coming today. So I hope I've covered everything by way of introduction, and so I will hand straight over to Simon to get cracking with the results of the 2021 Healthy Street Scorecard.
Hi folks, I'm hoping everyone can see that. That's just my holding page. Alice has done a wonderful job of introducing the scorecard, the partners. I just wanted to say thanks to everyone who's worked on this year, but also thanks to the amazing speakers we've got coming up, and to Professor Rachel Aldred at the University of Westminster, who provided initial technical expertise on some of these inputs and output indicators, outcome indicators. And I wanted to start by talking really, and we're going to rattle through the actual results. Really, this is a huge document and a huge report with a lot of data in it. So what I would urge is everyone go read the report after this webinar, and dive into the statistics for your borough, your area. What's really interesting is now and more than ever, I think you can see that pretty much every borough in London does something useful, interesting, positive, but also that every borough has its weak points as well. There are always kind of pros and cons. So absolutely, please, if wherever you are in London, have a look at the scorecard, have a look at how your borough is doing, what your borough is doing well, what it's not doing well, and then use that. But I wanted to start to talk about and really this is the kind of, I'm going to bookend this bit of the webinar with just the 2020 and the year that we had, and what a year it was in all sorts of ways. So someone said this to me, this quote, there are decades when nothing happens, and then there are weeks when decades happen. It's a Lenin quote. And I just, I really wanted to highlight, we had the pandemic last year. It was obviously has transformed huge swathes of public society, has been horrific to deal with, but has also demonstrated just how much can be done, how quickly and how boldly when there is a genuine crisis. So I wanted to say, we've talked about, I think Alice has introduced the scorecard very ably. We wanted to track boroughs on their progress on the Healthy Streets agenda, on climate, on all the actions that are possible to do with the road transport system. And we wanted to track them using publicly available data that we harvested, etc., that we could replicate year after year. I wanted to also talk about the background to all of this. In the last year, what we had as a huge shift was, as TfL funding collapsed, ridership collapsed, in the crisis, the DfT and the government and TfL worked together on what became known as street space funded schemes, these temporary schemes that popped up everywhere. And the government's version of it, the DfT's version of it, was called the Emergency Active Travel Fund, the EATF. That funding wrangle is ongoing and obviously is going to impact London hugely for the next couple of years. At the very least, what happens if public transport levels remain low and people continue to shun the public transport, both in terms of car use and in terms of our roads from that point of view, but also in terms of funding is going to be huge. But again, what this all showed and demonstrated was that London boroughs were in incredibly trying circumstances able to react incredibly fast using very limited money. And I guess that raises a slightly cheeky question in a way, which is how come they weren't doing all of that before? So, if boroughs can act the way they have this last year with very limited funding, what was stopping them from doing that before? Now, that is a cheeky question. There are all sorts of structural reasons why things happen in a very different way. But I guess it underlines the ability for boroughs to move fast when really there are issues like this. And I guess, for me personally, that highlights, we come out of one crisis, we're going straight into the teeth of another one, the climate crisis. Pretty much every London borough has declared a climate emergency. Even those that haven't declared a climate emergency have produced news releases and have publicly stated how important the climate emergency is to tackle. So we all recognise, London recognises the importance of climate and climate change and man-made climate change. What we do about it in the next few years is going to be absolutely vital. So I think that's I wanted to say as well, like, my cheeky question aside, I personally, I think all of us have over the year that the active travel campaigners, the transport campaigners have become aware over the last year of how hard officers and councillors have had it, how tough it has been getting through this crisis. So I wanted to extend a personal thanks on that basis. But yeah, coming up next year, we have not only the local elections, which is obviously going to be a big issue, but also the climate emergency. So really, I wanted to point out, we can be bold, we can move fast, but also from the mayoral election, we can see, that actually doing so wins us votes, doesn't lose us votes. So that's the context. So over to the overall results. What I'd point out and remind everyone is these indicators, the 9 indicators, 5 input indicators, quick things we can do relatively cheaply to change our streets, and the outcome indicators, the longer term results of those inputs. These indicators are all rate based, and I thought that was really important to kind of mention. This isn't just a case of how many, for instance, in road danger, how many killed and seriously injured people there are walking and cycling in a borough. It's how many per stage. So every one of these indicators is about a percentage or a rate rather than a number in its kind of full thing. It's fairly obvious if you look at the chart on the right, you can see that there is an inner and outer London kind of structural issue here. But I think it's really important to understand that even in the outer reaches of outer London and even in the middle of central London, there are vast differences in the overall score and in the individual indicators that you see. So what is happening in the city is different from what's happening in Westminster and K&C. What's happening in Waltham Forest is different from what's happening in Enfield and Barnet. So there are huge structural differences, and the level of divergence in both the type of action but the level of action that's being taken is really vital. At the bottom of my slide there, it says all boroughs must do more. And again, this comes back to the climate emergency. This comes back to the climate emergency. We have a crisis. We've come out of a crisis. Even in this crisis, we've started to see boroughs acting fast and being bold. Some boroughs, a few boroughs, were managing that pace before the crisis. But from now on, we have to maintain a pace, to transform our roads and our society rapidly. Every report, every piece of the climate change committee's evidence, etc., coming out just underlines that more and more. So, drilling down, I'm going to cover off very quickly now the 5 input indicators. These are the things that boroughs can do quite quickly. Some of them have been dramatically changed over last year. 20 miles an hour coverage, controlled parking zones, cycle tracks, low traffic neighbourhoods, and school streets primarily, but the STARS programme as well. So this is measures around schools. In 20 miles an hour, what we can see is that while TfL's borough counting very slightly, pretty much everyone from I think about Lewisham onwards has covered all the roads they have control of with 20 miles an hour. Now, some of those boroughs in the top, the top percentiles have done it in a year. So these boroughs have gone from nothing virtually 20 miles an hour to everything 20 miles an hour, and I think that proves that other boroughs, down at the bottom there, Barnet, Hillingdon, places like that, they can do this as well. There is not this is not a huge cost. This is not a dramatic political issue. This is actually just something that is doable. And we know what happens when boroughs do start rolling out 20 miles an hour, which is speeds do come down and KSIs come down. The most serious conditions come down. So if a borough does nothing else, it can surely do this. Moving very swiftly on controlled parking zones, we have again a huge range, and we know, those boroughs at the bottom, Bromley, Sutton, Redbridge, Hillingdon, Enfield, etc. These are boroughs where there are even underground, overground train stations, for instance, where there is freely available parking on residential roads right next to the station. This surely is not a good thing. I live, as most of you probably know, and I'm infamous for it, I live in Waltham Forest. We see people who try and park up at the edge of a zone from Essex and then get a bus, walk a mile, 2 miles, etc. The appetite for parking from those outside London who are looking for free parking inside London is huge. And this has a huge impact on borough roads, pollution levels, congestion, etc. So we should be able to do more on this. This data now comes to us from Appy Parking, so I just wanted to give them a quick plug there. It's one of the many sources. You can find all the sources for documents in the report. Cycle tracks, moving swiftly on. This year we used Safe Cycling and London Mapping. This is a volunteer who has, out of his own time, been mapping obsessively just about every piece of cycling infrastructure in London. And the mapping meant that we could really accurately not only calculate TfL side routes, but old 1930 cycle tracks and all sorts of other stuff. So we think this has given us probably one of the most accurate results that we've had in the 3 years this has been running. What you can see is, the entire range of parking goes from 12 to 0% of borough roads. So this is the percentage of borough road length that cycle tracks are on. Now, it's a slightly awkward figure because we also include TfL cycle tracks in a borough. But what this demonstrates, I think, is that we have still got a hugely long way to go on cycle tracks. We know they work. We know they boost the diversity and number of people cycling. We know they make cycling safer, unlike advisory lanes with dotted paint. So we know this stuff is vital if you want to get more people out of cars and more people on bikes. And yet the top result is a mere 12% of roads. Okay, moving swiftly on low traffic neighbourhoods. We also used the Safe Cycling in London map for this. It's a map on Google. You can find the guy on Twitter very easily. And what we've done here for this year is we've compared the percentage of borough roads or borough area that TfL in its strategic neighbourhood analysis believes could be covered by an LTN, low traffic neighbourhood, with what is actually being covered. We hope next year, because TfL's analysis includes measures of social equity and priority, access to green space, indices of multiple deprivation, etc. We hope to actually be able to compare and weight that so that we can show which boroughs are delivering low traffic neighbourhoods on a socially equitable basis. We know overall from research from Professor Aldred and others at the Active Travel Academy that the broad sweep of low traffic neighbourhoods were delivered socially equitably last year, but there is huge variance in that between boroughs. We haven't been able to manage to track that metric this year, but we're hoping to next year. In the bottom right corner, you can see a little patch of Islington and I think Tower Hamlets, showing the kind of granularity of the data involved and how close in we get with these. So obviously, delivery has varied, and you can see this via the map hugely from borough to borough. There's been some massively fast progress from some boroughs. Fairly obviously, low traffic neighbourhoods appears to be one of the media stories of the year in terms of the level of opposition to it. But the more we see the evidence coming back, the more early adopters of this approach have been vindicated, in my view. So these are the stats, and again the range. So we're starting to see huge areas of London being covered, and again some of those top boroughs were nowhere near where they are now, even only a year ago. Moving swiftly on school streets, we track both stars, TfL stars at Progress and school streets. Again, a huge range of results. I have to point out, by the way, poor Sutton down at the bottom, slightly unfairly getting a 0 rating there. They pulled out all their school streets just at the point that we cut the data off, but actually they then needed to, they did it because they wanted to consult on them. They're now consulting on them. So I very much hope that Sutton will be off that bottom level by the time we run the next indicator. And I obviously hope that Bexley will as well, but they don't have the excuse that Sutton has. Okay, moving swiftly on outcome indicators. These are the long-term results of the input indicators, but I think it's also really important to understand they're also long-term indicators of things like housing density, wealth, other issues as well, very clearly. They're slow to respond, but there is, and while there is a clear link between, you know, what's in inner London and what's in outer London and the results, there is also, in my view, clear signs now that the evidence, that the input schemes are beginning to impact the long-term results of the outputs. Mode share. What I think is really important here is to talk about two things. One is that this brings in, you know, the amount of people walking, cycling, and using public transport. There are big differences in every borough between boroughs on walking and public transport. Virtually no boroughs are doing brilliantly on cycling. Very, very few, but there are huge differences between boroughs that are doing well on walking and badly on public transport, boroughs that are doing well on public transport and badly on walking. So I think this is one to really have a look at your mode share each year. I think, you know, there's a lot to be done to move people away from cars is the overall result here. And you know, interesting, there's a David Metz article recently that talked about the risk of cannibalizing public transport by shifting people to cycling, for instance. But the simple truth is we just need to do all of it and move as many people away from cars using all the other modes as possible, as quickly as possible. Regular active travel, we track the 5 times a week proportion of the borough that does active travel. This is one of the areas where we do a rolling several years into one. I think it's 2 years into one result, because otherwise it fluctuates so massively. What's striking to me, and you've got at the top you've got walking and at the bottom you've got cycling, is what's striking to me is that walking seems very heavily dominated by density. You know, so you come out of your house, you have your 15-minute neighborhood right on your doorstep, and that's what enables you to walk. What's interesting about cycling is this seems to be, at the moment, far more of an indicator of the potential for cycling, the demand for cycling, than whether these boroughs are putting in good cycling infrastructure. And in fact, some of the boroughs that have the highest levels of regular cycling also have some of the most hostile and dangerous roads and have done the least for cycling. So that's a real opportunity for those boroughs if they want to reduce their road danger risk, if they want to increase their cycling further rapidly, to catch up on that. Moving on to road risk, this is on the left. You've got pedestrian serious and fatal casualties by 100,000 daily stages, and on the right you've got cycling by 1,000 daily stages. And again, what's interesting here is that some of the boroughs that are doing actually very well in terms of boosting active travel are doing badly on danger. I know Philip will talk later from Hackney. You know, what's really interesting as well is we've highlighted this year, we've separated out. Previously, we were running all of pedestrian and cycling risk together. And this year, what's notable, for instance, is that Hackney is one of the bottom ones in terms of walking risk, but nowhere near the bottom in terms of cycling risk. So there's a real opportunity to interrogate this data this year in a way that we haven't done before, that I think is really vital. So yeah, you know, and again, there are notable things like, for instance, Havering being, you know, very safe for cycling is essentially likely because no one cycles in Havering, not because cycling in Havering is safe. So again, interrogate the data. Final output, so outcome indicator, car ownership. There are obvious links to wealth, but it's also clear that some boroughs are doing amazing work on enabling people to live without cars. And this also demonstrates, again, where political will is needed to serve a clear majority who don't have access to cars. Islington and Hackney, you know, are clearly enabling, and Tower Hamlets are clearly enabling residents to live without cars. Westminster, you know, maybe not so much. So we'll hear from Councillor Jim Glenn in a while on that. The overall picture then is that there is huge variation between the boroughs, and that represents a huge opportunity for every single borough to do better. It is clear to me, and I think the coalition partners, that political will is absolutely the single most important indicator. We can't measure it, we can't track it as a metric, but it is the difference between the boroughs that have managed to deliver this year, that have been delivering prior to this year, and the ones that haven't. What's also interesting is that the mayor, has control of a very few roads, and the boroughs have a slightly different agenda in some cases than his transport strategy. How that plays out over the next few years is going to be fascinating. Obviously, opposition's change comes from those areas where driving culture is most seriously embedded, car dominance is most seriously embedded. Turning that around has to be a priority. And as I've said before, to end on the note from me that says we go from one crisis into the next few years, the next local election term, the next mayoral term, the current mayoral term, will define what London does in terms of the climate emergency. So the pace has to stay up. Back to Alice.
Thank you so much, Simon. That was incredible, and just there's so much there. As he said, you know, really what you need to do is look into the detail over the next week or so. So we're now going to turn to some local councillors from around London and across the political parties. So we're going to start with Councillor Sharma Tatler from Brent, who's the lead member there for Regeneration, Property and Planning, and to talk to us about the results, but also what they feel that should be happening, what council should be doing over the coming year and indeed the coming years. So yes, over to Sharma.
Thank you, and thank you, Simon, for that the scorecard. It's really telling about how much progress and where the journey's going for various London councils, particularly in Brent. So thank you everyone for coming in and listening, and hope I'm able to contribute something of our experiences of active travel and the shift around how we travel in London and how we travel in Brent. For those of you that don't know Brent, we sit in the northwest corner of London. Wembley sits at the heart of our borough. So as you can imagine, this week is going to be considerably busy for us. But we border Barnet and Harrow in the north, and we border Westminster, Camden in the south. And it's a borough that is split in many ways, geographically, in terms of transport, in terms of kind of wage and affluence and deprivation. So I'll give you a kind of a context. So the North Circular cuts our borough in half. So ULEZ is going to benefit, it cuts right through our borough, which is in itself, I think, a challenge and a benefit. We also have 50% of our residents don't own a car. We have the wages in our borough is averaging around £36,000 a year, but in some wards, Stonebridge and Harlesden, for example, which border the North Circular, it can go as low as £18,000 a year. The feel of the borough is very different, primarily because of our North Circular cut. So the south of the borough feels very central London, feels very urban, got Kilburn, Cricklewood, very kind of Brondesbury, very, very, very high active rates in terms of travelling and cycling. And so north of the borough is very much suburban. We border Harrow and Barnet. It feels like Harrow and Barnet, where car ownership in certain households will be 3 or 4 cars per household. My own ward, for example, is in the north of the borough. I have residents where we have, 2 or 3 cars per household, multi-generational household, plus another vehicle for work. So we have that disparity there. In addition, we're one of the most well-connected public transport boroughs in London, outside the central boroughs. 23 underground stations in Brent. I think it's one of the highest in London, which probably explains some of the mode share data that Simon was actually sharing with us earlier, and the necessity around kind of promoting that. And that's really driven Regeneration and my role in transport strategy about how we approach that whole agenda. So very much so that we have density and growth in areas where there's good public transport access. All our new developments are car free. Hence why we're having more and more residents move to the borough. They don't own a car. And so it's now incumbent on me to look at infrastructure that supports that active travel mode. So we are currently working on, obviously, the 20-mile-hour road network across the borough. I should also point out that we had a scrutiny task group called Brent Breathes, which was headed up by my colleague, Tom Stevens, which did a huge amount of work on looking at what we need to be doing in terms of supporting better air quality in Brent. We have some of the worst air quality roads in London, North Circular and the Edgware Road are particularly bad, and often they hit the most deprived communities. So we're looking at doing that. So we've introduced low traffic neighbourhoods, which we call Brent healthy neighbourhoods, because primarily we want to look at low traffic neighbourhoods as being more than just about displacing or changing travel in terms of vehicle traffic. We want to encourage more activity. We have a considerable significant number of residents that do no activity at all. We have issues around childhood obesity and inactivity as well. So we want to really encourage the whole approach to healthy neighbourhoods as being more than just about cycling and walking. It's about a whole public health approach, which is why we're calling them Brent healthy neighbourhoods. So along with that, we have over 33 school streets. So before lockdown, we had 2 school streets. Now we have over 33 with a waiting list of more schools coming along. And then a new lot of funding from TfL means that we're getting cameras involved now, and actually more schools in areas that we didn't think were wanting school streets are now asking for them, because the residents see the benefits of the school streets. We're collecting data as we speak about how children are travelling to school, and hopefully that'll indicate and show and give us evidence to show that actually the travelling methods to school are changing. We know anecdotally children in lockdown have been very inactive, and some unfortunately have put on issues around overweight and kind of health issues. So we're hoping that this will be part of the conversation to combating that. So we're really proud of our School Streets programme. Some of the difficulties we've had, obviously controlled parking. Wembley being part of our borough means that we are quite stringent on our controlled parking, and we make sure that actually travelling in public transport is a lot easier. And so we're continuing to do work on auditing our controlled parking zone for the borough and seeing whether we can roll it out much further beyond what we've already got. Leaders very, very keen to look at how we have some element of parking controls across the borough, because it is starting to kind of really hit home about how much car usage and how many cars are impacting our network. And finally, on our healthy neighbourhoods, in terms of the positivities and the challenges that we are facing. So the opposition to healthy neighbourhoods initially was very extreme. We've had some quite difficult and hostile behaviour. So much so that we've had people turn up angry to my councillors' houses, which we've had to kind of manage, because the emotion and the media kind of outcry on these initiatives were very skewed, were very unbalanced in my view, and they didn't really talk about what the benefits are. And I think in many ways it's a challenge for us as a local authority. We're very much in our infancy. If you compare us to other outer London boroughs, Waltham Forest, for example, we're very much new to this game in comparison. So it's a learning journey for us. In addition, there is the culture within parts of our borough and communities, and kind of how they view travelling is something that we have to work on, and understanding that actually there's a perception in certain parts of our borough, and I'm guessing that's outer London as well. The central London is the area where we don't need cars. In outer London is where we can have our car, or we should have a car. So we're having these conversations increasingly about actually, we're not saying don't have a car, but do you need to use a car every day? Do you need to use a car for that 10-minute journey, that 5-minute journey? You don't. You can walk to your high streets. We have 19 high streets in Brent. And actually, I think everyone lives within walking distance of one. So actually promoting your local business is beneficial, as well as health impacts of walking to your local high streets. So that's a piece of work that we're doing. And we've engaged like Living Streets, and I know Jeremy's here, to work with us over the next sort of few months to look at how we really engage residents, and look at how we not listen to loudest voices, because quite often they're the ones that are quite, active in contributing to consultation engagements. We're going to all residents in those areas, saying, what is it that you want to see for your neighbourhood? What is it that you want to see safer, cleaner, greener? And we're having those conversations, and we're starting to see actually the tide turn, where we've had areas where we've had healthy neighbourhoods put in. Residents are saying, actually, we do value the fact that our street is quieter, our children are safer playing outside. We are seeing actually petitions now coming to full council saying we really support healthy neighbourhoods, and we want to continue them, and we want to see them growing out more. And crucially, we're also seeing councillors who were once vehemently against healthy neighbourhoods actually turning around and saying to us, I actually see the benefits now, and we're really going to work with you to support it. So it's been a cultural shift, and we're still on that journey. The political will is there. We probably aren't going to be as fast as some other boroughs, but we are working and pushing to kind of get to that place. And I think it's worth also noting resourcing for boroughs like Brent, where this is a completely new agenda almost for us, is difficult. Our highways team are stretched and they are doing phenomenally well in terms of reaching out to other boroughs, other experts to try and get that expertise in. But it's also trying to kind of understand that local authorities' positions in terms of officer resource, not in terms of capital investment into the schemes themselves, can also be quite difficult. So managing that is something that we're having to grasp. But it's a journey that we are really keen on. Climate emergency is something that we're really, really keen to push. And we're happy to be on this journey. And, we look forward to kind of having a cleaner Brent and ultimately a cleaner London.
Thanks so much, Sharma, and thanks for to all the councillors across London who are putting their heads above the parapet and sadly in some cases being threatened, as you said. So, but the positives, as you say, are just becoming clearer and clearer. We hope as we move along. So we're now going to move to a very different borough, Westminster, where Councillor Jim Glenn, who's a cycling champion there among other roles, is going to talk to us about what they've been doing there and what they're planning for the future as well.
Thank you, Alice. Firstly, may I say how delighted I am to be invited to join you here today. As you said, I'm a local councillor in Westminster and I serve as the cycling champion, so looking to promote responsible cycling across the whole of the borough. I think everyone here today and across the political spectrum would agree that tackling climate change is the most important challenge of our generation. Westminster Council, along with many other councils, declared a climate emergency in 2019. And we've committed as a council to becoming net zero by 2030. And obviously there are many different aspects to that ambition, which are all interlinked, and transport plays a key role in it. Cleaner, greener modes of transport are important for all, not just those who cycle themselves, but residents and visitors who breathe the same air. Just under 250,000 people live in Westminster. And before the pandemic, that number was swelled to over 1 million every day with visitors. We've got 55,000 businesses. We've got 700,000 jobs in our borough, which is 8 square miles. The Healthy Street scorecard makes fascinating reading. I'm delighted to see Westminster move up from 8th to 5th, but acknowledge that there is a lot still to do. In response to the pandemic, Westminster introduced over 30 cycling and footwear schemes, as has been talked about. Were introduced across London. They're introduced at speed under temporary traffic orders. And it did give us a unique opportunity for a step change. As many more of our residents and those visitors that still came in were encouraged to take up cycling with the nervousness of using public transport, many for the first time. But we can't, in that process, ignore the consultation that is required to make many of these schemes permanent without alienating those that live here and who deserve the right to be consulted and brought along with us. The very fact that we in Westminster have very small streets with many different users and, as I said, up to 1 million visitors a day shows the challenge. Street space is limited and there are many competing users. When low traffic neighbourhoods were consulted upon in Westminster, there was an extraordinarily significant vocal opposition. I know that schemes in other boroughs have had to be withdrawn, not least because of the displacement of traffic to other areas and the worse air pollution resulting in them when these schemes are introduced, maybe without thinking through the full implication of them. We need to bring our residents with us and design schemes that work for all road users, including obviously those that rely on motorised transport, maybe the blue badge holders who need to get around. We all want better air quality and to address the climate emergency, but it's kind of, we need to bring people with us, consult and make sure that everybody benefits. I live in Pimlico, which is not listed as a low traffic neighbourhood in your presentation, but it was designed as such in the 1970s. It's based on a grid system. Streets were blocked, one-ways were put in precisely to stop through traffic. It's the same aims of the low traffic neighbourhood, just from a different era. And unfortunately, because of the media frenzy that Sharma mentioned, low traffic neighbourhoods seem to have an image problem with residents. I mean, that there are benefits, you know, obvious benefits to everybody that lives in the area in having less through traffic, safer streets that children can play on. But these are not sold well to our residents, and we need to be better at selling them. I'm chair of governance of our local primary school, which is just by Victoria Station, and as such has one of the smallest and most polluted playgrounds, I would guess, in the country. We do have a school street. It was introduced during the pandemic and we've hung on to it. I think Westminster, similarly, we had one school street before the pandemic. We now have, I think, 17. And we are consulting and monitoring them to look at what effect it has. But I can tell you from a school's point of view that we love them. We'll hopefully make them permanent later in the year. Sort of to sum up, I'd just say that there are many different groups with many different leads, all living in a very small space, and we need to talk to everybody and bring them along with us. And for that, the Healthy Streets scorecard is really useful. So I would say thank you very much for bringing it to us. It plays a vital part in that process of persuasion. It poses questions of all the boroughs and highlights what we've got to do. Thank you.
Well, thanks very much, Jim. I think you've put that quite succinctly, and I think we're extremely conscious in the coalition that we, not just we ourselves, but all the members and all the people we're connected to, need to be able to demonstrate the support for these measures in order to be able to present vocally the other side of the debate. So I think we feel that the onus is very much on us as well as you and councils to make that happen. So we're going to move now to Caroline Russell, who's the Green Party member, London Assembly member, and chair of the Health Committee at the London Assembly. Rather crucially, she's also a councillor in Islington, which has topped the scorecard this year, although obviously not part of the administration there. But Caroline will hopefully be able to say a couple of words about Islington too. So over to you, Caroline.
Sorry, I should have learned how to unmute myself by now. Hello, everyone. I'm Caroline Russell, and I'm here today really with my hat on as a councillor in Islington. And looking through all the results, I was reading through all the details last night, and I was struck by how long so much of this stuff has been going on. So it made me think back to the late 1990s in Islington when controlled parking was being rolled out. And then it was a Lib Dem administration, and they were taking the political heat from being pretty robust about rolling out controlled parking street by street. And I'm sorry to say that I was really against controlled parking back in 1990. I thought it was going to be a bit weird and unnecessary. And we won for our street not to be controlled parking. The moment it came in the streets next door, we were clamoring for controlled parking. And we kind of, from that moment on, I became much more aware of the difference that it makes to a local area. And it's something that it's really shocking how some boroughs like Islington have had controlled parking since the late 1990s, and other boroughs have very little controlled parking. And it really is one way that you can make a big difference in your borough. But I was also thinking about the traffic calming that went on in the early 2000s, which was to mitigate the rollout of the congestion zone. And that led to pockets of 20 mph limits all over Islington. which then in 2010 were following a budget amendment by a Green councillor, Katie Dawson, who got a budget amendment in with the Labour group and the Lib Dem group, because no one knew which budget was going to pass because it was a hung council, and to get 20 mph rolled out on all borough roads. Katie lost her seat in 2010, but the 20 mph limit went through and Labour won the election and carried through the 20 mph limit. Then Islington got 20 mph limits on its main roads. That was because some of us involved with Living Streets and with the local group, the LCC, were really pushing to make that happen. And that came kind of around 2012, 2013, that sort of time. So some of this stuff has been going on for many years, and politicians have been taking the heat and have been being brave and actually have had the vision to say to residents, yes, this stuff can work. So what we have right now is low traffic neighbourhoods being rolled out at scale. And I'm so impressed by the Islington officers and also by particularly Rowena Champion, who's the Labour executive member in Islington at the moment, who has held her nerve and has rolled out these widespread low traffic neighbourhoods across our borough. Now, there are lots of lessons for us to learn from this, and I think, you know, we're talking about that a lot. There's work that could be done with health partners, thinking about, you know, for a midwife or district nurse doing their rounds, if they're using a car, then actually the rounds that they make will change when you have a low traffic neighbourhood in place, because streets that used to be adjacent and easy to reach by car together are now less convenient to access together. So there are bits of work that need to be done with traders, with health partners, to actually to make these low traffic neighbourhoods bed in and work properly. But it is, and you have to be ready for an absolute onslaught of email. It's inevitable. People find change a real surprise, and but as I say, the Islington officers have run an amazing job of kind of helping all the local councillors who are getting a huge amount of email. And the important thing is to keep speaking with residents. And I'm losing count of the number of conversations I've had with people who say, I thought it was a bit weird at first. I thought it was a pain. It's definitely less convenient for me to use my car. And you know what? I'm using my car less, and actually I'm really glad about that. And I think people are seeing the difference that this can make. I think there's a challenge for the scorecard, and I would say, you know, have a think next year with the scorecard. Is there something that you can bring in around accessibility? Is there a measure for accessibility? Is there something to do with Transport for All? I think we've just commissioned in my ward an accessibility audit of the whole ward, and we're going to be really thinking about, sometimes it's very simple things like dropped curbs. It's kind of thinking, is the parking too close to corners of streets? There's all sorts of small things, and literally, are the pavements smooth and even? Because if you're walking with a white cane and you have a properly smooth and even pavement, your life is an awful lot easier, because you're not having to kind of work out, oh, is that a paving slab I'm going to trip on, or is it the edge of the curb? Am I about to come in contact with traffic? So that's my challenge. Simon talked about cheeky questions earlier on. That's my cheeky question. And then just finally, on my way here this morning, I dropped off at Drayton Park School, because that's come up in the local papers. Because the head is really worried about people cycling on the new cycle lane past the school at school pickup and drop off time. And I popped by, I saw kind of cones in the cycle lane, a lollipop person trying to make the cyclists go into the main flow of the traffic. And then I stopped and had a chat with the school keeper and with a resident who lived across the road, who was very grumpy about the bike lane. And it turned out that last night there was a collision, and a car bumped into a child. I believe they're okay, but an ambulance was called and the police were called. And the danger was not from the cycling. The danger was actually from some parked cars, which were reducing sight lines, and a car that actually bumped into a child. And I think we have to really think, when we're thinking about road danger, we have to be thinking about what it is that causes the most harm, and helping our communities to understand where the harm comes from. We need to listen. You know, people, if you're elderly, if you're disabled, having a bike coming up quietly and fast behind you can be distressing. It can lead people to stumble and fall, and you know that is understandably absolutely distressing. But we also need to think about where the main harm is coming from, which is from these cars, which are huge, getting bigger every year, taking up more space on our roads, and also belching out pollution, which is damaging our health. So I think we just need to get in proportion where the harm is coming from. Thank you.
Thanks, Caroline. Thanks so much, and thanks for bringing up those issues. So, road danger, obviously, is particularly close to our hearts, and we're particularly conscious that it's not a well-known fact, for example, that the majority of people who are hurt on the roads are pedestrians, and again, the onus is on us to really make very clear, the level and scale of road danger that continues out there. That we really need to tackle. And also, thank you for bringing up the issues around accessibility, which are also, of course, very close to our hearts. And the consciousness that it's not just people with disabilities, but also older people, or even people with just people with buggies. There are many people who need to have clear pavement ways, and also just people who want to walk sociably. And not face constant obstruction on the pavements, for example. So those are issues which are extremely close to our hearts as well. And also, finally, I'm very glad that you brought up the issue of supporting other councillors from other parties, and that kind of segues me neatly to Philip Clanville, who's chair of the London Council's Transport and Environment Committee, and the fact that we need to be supportive of councillors from all parties who are taking action, and to be as non-partisan as possible in this, to really just get the job done for London. So yeah, over to you, Philip.
Thanks, Alice, and thank you for the invite today and the work the whole coalition has done over the last couple of years for creating this kind of annual moment in London's civic calendar. I think it's incredibly important. As you said, I'm chair of the Transport and Environment Committee at London Councils. It's a cross-party group that is predominantly kind of environmental and transport leads from the London boroughs, but it's a wide range of portfolios, some that are leading on active travel, some that are leading on climate. And I can see many of my colleagues, past and present, on the call, so no pressure to talk about what we're doing collectively. And I think what we've seen today is this incredible amount of leadership across London, but we couldn't do it, I don't think, without civic society engaging with us and co-producing some of these solutions. So from Living Streets to Cycling Campaign, I also, as a political leader, stand on, in the Hackney sense, the shoulders of giants, including Ferial John, Vincent, and now Mette, who I know is on the call. None of us as borough leaders, though, could do it without the officers, and I'm going to come back to their capacity a bit later on, because I think we've achieved so much. The Lenin quote at the start of Simon's presentation, I know people are hungry for more, but there are some challenges there. And what we do at TEC couldn't be done without TfL, the London Council's officers, the borough professional networks, the Mayor, Will, and Heidi, and indeed our Assembly members as well. I think we've heard powerfully from Sharma, Jim, and Caroline what has been happening in local boroughs. And I know that Caroline Pidgeon will come on a little bit more about the Assembly in a second. Just to sort of step back a bit, boroughs are responsible for roughly 95% of London's road network. And I think that can sometimes be forgotten in the debate with TfL and what's been done on made roads. And so much of what we've been talking about today is about that local, hyper-local level and what's happening in and around our town centres and boroughs. So all the things we're talking about, including school streets, the work in town centres, the critical relationship between pedestrian safety and active travel, and how we use our powers and budget. But there is a definite link back to the TfL budget situation, which I'll come back to as a challenge, I think, for 2022. And boroughs have been doing this for a number of years. I think it's really helpful that we've gone back and mapped existing cycleways and some of those early LTNs and other road closures. Now, when those road closures went in, it may not have been about creating more livable neighbourhoods. It may have been dealing with joyriding and some of the challenges of the 80s and 90s, but they have contributed to changing the shape of our streets and what boroughs have been doing. The network that exists around London councils and the officer team, I can't say how important it has been, especially in the last 15 months, sharing knowledge, sharing experience, developing best practice, comparing notes on communications and engagement, working with legal teams. And I think there's a real close relationship between the officer and the political at that level, and providing just independent advice on a cross-party basis, because I think that has also helped us show leadership. You've referenced, obviously, critical delivery arm for the streetscape work. London Councils itself doesn't have a view on the type of streetscape work because we are that cross-party body. So we've worked with the grain of different types of LTN, different types of interventions, different types of cycle interventions. And I think there is value to subsidiarity. There isn't a one-size-fits-all view. And I will always favour the idea that boroughs know their places best, even if some of you as activists get frustrated with your boroughs and compare us to each other. I think this should be a race to the top, but we're all developing new ideas. And I think that's strengthened as well what London's trying to do together. We also lobby on some of the things that we still need. There is a vast gap between DFT regulated signage and what we're doing around things like school streets. We want decriminalisation of speeding so that we can do more around the 20-mile-an-hour enforcement and work with TfL better on some of those routes that are still challenging. And I think we're constantly sort of advocating to government that they need to do more around funding active travel and that work. And I'm a big believer in recognising some of the strengths obviously London has. We have that close relationship. We have TfL, we have London councils, but we're also historically underfunded in terms of our transport infrastructure. And we've seen that through the pandemic, the fall in tube fares and the impact on TfL finances. And we produced, along with partners, a State of the City report, which just illustrate, even though we've done all this amazing work, there's £1 billion deficit in highway maintenance in London. And I think that's not talked about enough. If you're a cyclist, pedestrian, car driver, all three, bus user, the expansion of potholes and challenges, I think, will have a real impact on the confidence of new cyclists and also the aspirations around Vision Zero. And budget pressures continue. A lot of maintenance has been postponed due to COVID. I think we do need to focus in on some of those elements as well in terms of making sure that our streets are as safe as they can be. Londoners largely agree with this agenda. I think that's really important. Speakers have already said that, but London Council's done some cross-London polling and on air pollution, the concerns of Londoners from 2016, 83% of Londoners concerned about it. Now it's 93% last year. There's a recognition it's having an impact on individual Londoners' health. 43% are saying that they feel impacted by poor air quality. And they also think, 48%, that it's starting to impact the decisions they make about how they travel around our city. Londoners are also making that connection between air pollution, active travel and climate change. And we've seen no reduction in the interest of Londoners on this agenda. If anything, it's increased during the pandemic, and links across to social justice, which I think are incredibly important. Businesses are really keen to play their part on this as well. And we regularly survey business, and businesses are starting to think about how they can respond to this challenge. I think it was Simon earlier that talked about climate emergency and action plans. And it's 28 boroughs that have declared a climate emergency, and 24 boroughs already have climate action plans, with all of them committed to developing them over the next year. I don't think I need to say too much about the impact that air quality has on Londoners, but 9,000 premature deaths, the impact on children, the resolute focus on making sure that our schools are surrounded by the greenest environments they can be, I think is incredibly important. I think we saw what a different world can look like at some stages of lockdown in the pandemic. I think that has created that real wish to do more. But I think we've also seen, as I said, a huge amount happening in 1 year. And actually, there's quite a lot of consolidation that needs to happen. The final stages of engagement and consultation are incredibly important. The data that we need to present back to our residents about making final decisions as boroughs, and I think the long-term funding to embed these schemes. I think it's great that we've seen ETOs used, temporary planters, reimagining spaces in live time. And actually that has disproved some of the fiercest critics of these schemes, but it can also show that they need to be tweaked and changed. I think that experimental use is incredibly important going forward, but we also want to see the depaving, the planting, the additional infrastructure that supports those low traffic neighbourhoods, or whatever they're called, in individual boroughs. I think there's something also that it is very easy for some people to try and pick and choose from a menu of interventions. The Healthy Streets scorecard clearly shows the links between all of these interventions. It is very difficult to introduce a school street into a community that is car dominated, that doesn't have a CPZ, that there are no nearby filters, that there's no safe cycling infrastructure, and where public transport isn't favoured in transport hierarchy. So all of these things are linked, and the most successful school streets help animate LTNs and are connected by that other infrastructure. And I think that's incredibly important to make those links. I'm just going to for a sort of step back to Hackney for a second after talking about the London Council's perspective. I think political will is incredibly important, but it has to be linked with civic society as well. There are no brave political leaders without support of civic society, and that is no different in Hackney. We have been constantly challenged to do more, to rethink spaces, and that has been incredibly important. And I've seen, Brenda, Kylie, and others from Hackney on the call. I return to those themes of having to do everything and move on everything. We on CPZs have just done our final first stage of our final part of the borough about introducing CPZs. I'm really pleased that residents in Stamford Hill voted during the consultation, or supported during the consultation, the introduction of CPZ. So I think we'll move up through the scorecard there. We've done some work on safe cycling infrastructure, Queensbridge, Green Lanes, Wick Road, the CS1 Balls Pond Road interventions, and I've talked a lot about what we want to do around Seven Sisters and future routes. I'm really pleased to see us reach that 50% point around low traffic neighbourhoods. That is made up of those historic places, the big expansions in Hoxton West, London Fields and Hackney Downs this year. I used to talk about the humble bollard and what you could do with the humble bollard. I think we do need to move on from the humble bollard. A lot of what our colleagues in the emergency services are favouring camera controlled closures, and I think we should listen to them. And I think it's been some really good experience of those conversations with London councils and also in Hackney. But I think to reimagine the planter and the bollard still obviously has a massive role. Hoxton West is a really interesting example of an LTN. When I first got elected to council in Hoxton in 2006, I think we all started to think about air quality on the city fringe, and actually a really deprived social rent and private renter community on the city fringe, suffering a lot from traffic coming through that they hadn't created, some of the lowest levels of car ownership. It is only now through the ETO programme that we've been able to tackle that alongside ULEZ and ULEZ expansion. And I thank the work around mapping LTNs across London with socioeconomic factors and showing actually some of the biggest interventions in the last year have been for those communities where there perhaps wasn't the on the ground coalition of activists, but actually the data led you there in terms of deprivation and air quality. Huge journey on school streets, now 48, and we've been publishing the data of our original pilots. And I think I'm going to be cheeky and say all of our school streets are school streets that are enforced, signed, and we think about some of the infrastructure around it in terms of filters and those things in Hackney. I'm just going to go back to parking very briefly and say that we're keen in Hackney. We've got an ambitious new parking enforcement plan coming forward. I've seen a lot of boroughs bring forward additional parking measures at London councils and moving through the zones. I think there's a real commitment across London to getting parking right and seeing that as a crucial route in this response. I'm going to just finish on challenges. TfL funding is a huge challenge. We really need support, I think, on supporting TfL, City Hall, London councils have been doing work on a cross-party basis around the inequity of what we're trying to do and the instability of funding. It's having an impact on borough level projects, TfL, and the long-term planning we want to do as a city. So it's a hugely important takeaway. I know that Will Norman and Clyde and others are trying to make sure that the Active Travel Group are doing all they can to advocate, but we do need that stable funding settlement. We can't see pro rata in year changes to funding if we want to have long-term planning. We have to take the opportunity of COP and what cities can do and showcase the very best of what London is doing. There's some really interesting work around data sharing that's happening as well. And I think that sort of active city government and the role of city government and the boroughs in climate change, and learning also from other places that will come to COP and talk about their experience of this. I think trying new things is really important. The lead up to 2022, I'm not making a political sort of pitch, but I think working with boroughs, working with all parties, using that as an opportunity to push for more ambition in borough manifestos of all political parties is a real opportunity for all of the civic organisations represented here. Don't forget the bus in all of that campaigning. I'm going on to a London Travel Watch event this afternoon where we're talking about bus prioritisation and supporting the confident return of Londoners back to the bus. It's a crucial aspect in everything that we do in Hackney. And I think there are some coalitions that can be rebuilt around active travel and buses. And I just finished that people will obviously come out of this discussion, look at who's up, who's down, but actually there's something for everyone across London in this report, and some real ideas and data around where we can go next. And as I said at the start, really pleased to be here, and thank you all for organising this event and making sure we have this annual moment.
Thanks so much, Phil, and again for covering some issues there. So particularly the scale and complexity of what is facing the boroughs and the links with climate change and regeneration, and the challenges are just vast. Really, it's mind-boggling what councils have to deal with what we know to be dwindling resources, and for putting out there some of the challenges, some of the key challenges that you'll face that we need the London administration and the national government to be looking at. Just on a quick one, I wanted to say we're very interested in creating a metric around bus priority. So we really hope to have one in next year's scorecard even. So if you do some stuff on bus priority this year, then hopefully that will give you a good score in next year's scorecard if we can manage to do it by then. So yeah, thanks so much, Philip, and we're now going to go to Caroline Pidgeon, who until recently has been chairing the Transport Committee at London Assembly, but is now chair of the Oversight Committee at the GLA. And Caroline, I wanted to talk to us about, as a kind of final speaker, to talk to us about what we need the mayor to be doing, but also more generally just to talk about the results and what we need to be doing in the years ahead. So over to you, Caroline.
Thank you, Alice, and I am chair of the Transport Committee as well as the Oversight Committee, so I have an increasing workload this year, but it's great to be here with you, and delighted to be speaking today on this important subject. And I really welcome the Scorecard Coalition doing this detailed research. I think it's useful for all boroughs to step back, have a read, learn lessons from others, and work out how we can work and move this agenda forward. And thank you, Alice, for chairing today's event and bringing it together. In some ways, it's not surprising that the results vary by borough. And I don't think any council can be complacent when it comes to healthy streets. There's always more that everyone can be doing. And I thought, before I move on to talking about TfL and the Mayor, that I would just highlight some areas where I think some of the boroughs could be perhaps doing more and better. And some of this is around planning matters. I think there needs to be a far greater push for safe and secure cycle parking facilities. I think over the years this has been overlooked, and it may be coming up in newer developments, but you think of blocks that have been built over the last, I don't know, 30, 40 or 50 years. We've got to look at how we can support people in those homes to be able to cycle, to be able to park their bikes securely, and recognise also the challenges people living in multiple occupation properties. So actually that shift, and we have started to see it in some boroughs, from car parking over to cycle parking on the highways, I think is really important. And I think that's something some of the boroughs could be doing more of. I think also councils have got to be more bold in their assessments of the levels of parking that are actually needed for new housing developments. I think this for some boroughs is very difficult, but actually high levels of parking just create this sort of cycle. It's a self-fulfilling. And, you know, I think the new generation of people are far less obsessed by ownership. The whole idea of, you know, car hire, zip cars, that sort of thing, is much more the way that certainly younger people operate in every aspect of their life. You know, nobody owns music anymore; they download it. It's something in space, if you like. So I really think we've got to change the mentality around planning and how much parking provision is put in place. Obviously, you need to have space for blue badges, and we also need to think about car clubs and so on. But I think there's something vital there that more boroughs could be picking up. In terms of walking, clear pavements is really vital. And I think we've got to really recognise the needs of vulnerable pedestrians. And I like the point Caroline Russell made earlier, we need to look at accessibility as part of this wider picture. And whether that's advertising boards, defunct phone boxes, excessive signage, I think there is an issue there that boroughs could pick up. And I know Living Streets are launching a campaign on this next week, which I think is very timely. Councils, how they use their Section 106 money. This is really important, and pedestrian improvements need to be part of that. And then the one common theme that I picked up from all the speakers, and I think is really important, is consultation and engagement. Some of the concerns that have come out over the last 6 months about LTNs, it's about people feeling that this has been done to them rather than with them. And actually, when you talk to people, they're not against more walking and cycling. They quite like it, but it was done to them. First they knew about it, a road's blocked off. And that was because of the emergency legislation, how the funding came through. And I think boroughs, and really sharing good practice here, and I think Waltham Forest, I see Clyde's on the call. Waltham Forest, when they did their work on their cycling infrastructure, they learned from the first phase and actually got much better engagement with people. And I think we've got to look at that, because ultimately these schemes won't succeed if people don't have ownership of them. And I think that's the hard challenge that we've all got to look at. And in some places, rightly or wrongly, it's been pitched as the wealthier areas now have very nice quiet streets, but the poorer ones don't. And that may well not be true. And Philip shaking his head, you've looked at data, absolutely, but the perception. And so how do we work together cross-party, cross groups to deal with some of those myths? And I think that's going to be really important going forward. Because I've been asked really to speak about what the Mayor, what the TfL should be doing. And so I think really moving on to that, I think the Mayor must, difficult though it is, find, and in this financial climate, ensure we've got full funding for the long list of TfL schemes that were under TfL's Healthy Streets programme. They were all paused last year. And I think somebody's going to put a link into the chat for me on this. From a Mayor's question I asked, there are absolutely tons of really important schemes across London that were just paused. I think people have almost forgotten those healthy street schemes because we're focused on street space. We must make sure funding is secured for these. And this includes things like safe access across places like the South Circular, really, really important. And I think also the Mayor and TfL, if they're in a position again to be allocating at speed DFT funding, they need to work better with the boroughs. Too many times I heard from TfL, even from the Commissioner, oh, these are borough schemes, we're just merely funding them. there was no sense of that sort of partnership, joint ownership, which actually I think is needed if we're trying to bring communities with us and change almost that mindset across London. And I think boroughs were left to their own devices, kind of risks, blame absolutely being pointed at them, when actually TfL's expertise and support perhaps should have been more forthcoming. And I think that might have helped with some of the narrative around these schemes. That sort of political leadership and organisation leadership, I think, would have been helpful. And I think there were some issues at the start of some of these schemes. I think everyone would admit that poor signage that wasn't clear to the public. But actually, TfL probably could have helped with some of that. TfL could also have helped with perhaps sharing the road layouts with the emergency services. This gave, huge headlines, and quite rightly so. People worried that ambulances were delayed. But actually, if TfL had coordinated that earlier, got the information to the emergency services, we may not have been in that position. And I think that's something that can be learnt from all of this, and is a role that TfL has. I also think we need far more information in general to the public about dangerous roads, whether that's road casualties, and I've seen in the chat people talking about motorcyclists, huge worry, increase in people using two-wheeled powered vehicles, and actually the roads are very different probably to when they learnt many years ago. That's a huge worry, and we need to be looking at that as well. But on road casualty data, I've learnt in the last year that a lot of this data is not being made available to the public. So when I was looking at Lavender Hill, where the coroner recommended action following a cycle fatality back in 2016, I discovered that this data is just not being made available. And TfL, I understand, has mapped casualty harm rate and excess harm data to highlight the most harmful roads in London. And this information, I'm told, is available to boroughs, but I'm not clear in what format. But for me, actually putting that information out there into the public would be crucial. And I know London Cycling Campaign have been working hard to try and track this down. But if everyone has access to more data about the state of their roads, mapping information that TfL has undertaken in an accessible format, I think this would unleash real interest, public demand for safer roads, and really help boroughs in their work on their roads in this area. So I think that's a real priority for TfL. And then my final comment really is around the actions of the Mayor, not just around this agenda, but to highlight the needs of public transport, not merely active travel. And if you look at the data that you've published today and look at some of the places in London with highest car ownership rates, and I think Oliver Lord has been putting comments on this in the chat, they're places that are poorly served by public transport. And I think if you live in places like North London, you probably can't imagine a borough not having any tube stations. We'll go down to Bexley, Bromley, Sutton. These places aren't very well served by public transport. They're not very well served by orbital transport options as well. And if you work in the nearby town centre, if you're not prepared to cycle and the walk is a bit far, you may well choose to hop into a car. We need to look at how we can improve transport in outer London. And in terms of accessibility, whilst we can proudly say 84 tube stations are accessible, that means 186 are not accessible for many people. That's not on. And so we need to be looking at that as well. So I think if we want to transform our roads and our streets, then actually we've got to provide wider range of travel options, both the active travel, but also public transport, if we want to get people away from the car, as we've discussed earlier. And I think, there are some fabulous transport schemes that have been worked up, looking at TfL taking over the suburban railway lines in London, extending the Bakerloo line, step-free access, extending the tram. They all need to happen, and they would get that modal shift from cars. And in turn, they would ensure less traffic on our roads. But clearly the funding that we come back to, and Philip mentioned earlier, the funding is crucial here, making sure government funds TfL, funds London boroughs, so that we can keep on investing in public transport and other schemes is so important. So whilst investment in public transport may not be on the agenda, as it were, for this meeting, it's a vital component, I would suggest, in making that change on our roads and streets, and ultimately our communities and our quality of life, which is what all of this Healthy Streets work is about. So thank you for the work you've done, and I look forward to the discussion to follow.
Thanks so much, Caroline. And yeah, we're a little bit late. It's 11:20, but I just wanted to say a couple of things. So thanks for bringing us back to the planning issues and the perhaps obvious, but apparently not, statement that if you plan for cars, you get cars. And also for bringing us back to the consultation issues, which have been a feature of the past year. And I think it's a conundrum that we're going to battle with going forward. But we kind of need to remember things like, you know, when they put a scheme in, I can't remember where it was, in Holland maybe somewhere, where they had a consultation before a referendum and said, do you want this to be a low traffic neighbourhood? And everyone said no. But then they did a consultation, they did it anyway and put a consultation in after. Did the referendum after, and everyone said yes. So it reminded me of a conversation I had actually last night with somebody who said that Apple have never ever held a focus group. They don't believe in them because they don't think that people know what they think about something until they've actually got it, which I think is, you know, if we think about that, but also the fact that we've kind of set ourselves up for consultation in a way which gives people the idea that something is a referendum, which has not necessarily been that helpful, and we will be battling with that probably over the next year and years ahead as well. So yes, so thanks very much, Caroline, and we're going to have time maybe for a couple of questions. I will say that Jeremy has been collecting questions throughout and is going to give us hopefully maybe just a couple of questions now, and then we will commit to asking the panel to respond to questions that we haven't been able to respond to here, and getting back to you in the next few days. So Jeremy, what have we got?
Thanks very much, Alice, and thanks to all the speakers. I think it's been absolutely amazing. So there's been a really good sort of lively chat in the chat area, but I just wanted to sort of pick up on one theme really and just sort of look for the panel's comments. And it sort of started with a question by Stephen Boxall. Is the difference between the boroughs mainly down to their physical locations, inner and outer London, and what this means for individual circumstances? Or is it more about local politics? And just in terms of sort of the inner outer issue, Ollie, and Caroline just mentioned this, Ollie Lord said car ownership is also heavily linked to levels of public transport connectivity. There's a real need for outer London boroughs to come together with a plan and a campaign to improve this. So just, you know, where the panelists have thoughts about these differences between the boroughs and the nature of it, and the idea is exactly as we've talked about as public transport as the glue for improving performance levels in the scorecard.
I'm happy to start if that's okay. Yeah. So yes, I think I mentioned in the chat earlier. So whilst Brent may be a borough that's really well connected by tube stations, our bus routes and availability for buses, particularly for our lowest wage residents or lowest salary residents, buses are really crucial in for that mode shift. And I know Heidi Alexander has been looking at sort of consultations and work around auditing bus routes and bus capacity on the network. I think that needs to be speeded up. You know, a lot of my residents need the buses to be working, otherwise they're going to be using their vehicles, and we actually do need to get people onto a bus. The bus priorities are fantastic, the bus priority lanes are great, but often they're on the same road network where we've tried to do cycling infrastructure. And unless we have serious investment and work with TfL about proper segregated cycle lanes, that's going to be really difficult, because bus priority lanes are often on the roads that also need protected cycle highways. So that element in outer London is something that we're really battling with. And I know we're trying to work with TfL on one of our key cycling routes to try and make that happen. So I think there is a need. The orbital routes are, in terms of transport, are key. I think Caroline mentioned that earlier. You know, in our part of London, we're looking at the West London orbital, which should actually help that connectivity and connections to other modes of transport. But we do need to kind of see that progress forward. And I think Phil's point earlier about government prioritising sort of London, I think one thing that I'm really keen to advocate is that levelling up agenda does not mean that you level down London. Transport in London is massively crucial to the economic sustainability of our country, alongside the fact that we have some of the worst air pollution in Europe. And if the government aren't going to be strategic in saying, actually, we need to invest in our capital city alongside investing the rest of the nation, it doesn't mean that you diminish investment elsewhere, but you protect or you embolden making sure that you invest in the capital city. Otherwise, we are not going to achieve those aims that we want to achieve in terms of active travel or air pollution and so on. So my view is that actually it's not just us London boroughs that need to come together. I think as a city as whole, we need to be fighting much more around the line that you don't support the country by levelling down London.
Anyone else from the panel? So Caroline Russell, shall we go? And then Jim, and then Caroline Pidgeon.
Yes, I very much agree about the need for decent public transport, but I think we also need across inner and outer London to understand the harm that the massive rise in car traffic is doing to our city. And particularly also the fact these cars are getting bigger, they're longer, they're wider, they take up more space. So it's, literally cycling into City Hall this morning, I was cycling, there were wide cars parked and wide cars driving past me. And it does, if there isn't a protected bike lane, you are very much squeezed out. So I think we've got to think, what we just big picture, what we want for our city. Do we want to enable that incredible convenience that people get with using a private car? Or do we want to actually get to a point where owning a car is pretty unusual in London, and actually people are able to access what they need to access safely and conveniently on foot, by bike, or by public transport? And we really could show the way in how a city can reduce its air pollution, reduce the number of people being killed and seriously injured on the roads, and reduce our carbon emissions. And in sort of with the COP year sort of stretching ahead of us, we should be cross-party, really ambitious for what London can do. But it does need us to really question our kind of the dependence of so many Londoners on using a car currently, and whether we can shift the perception on that.
Thanks. So quickly from Jim and then Caroline, because we've now hit nearly 11:30.
Okay, thank you. Going back to the original question, yes, I think it does have a lot to do with the physical nature of the boroughs. And you've only got to look at the way the City of London stands out in the figures to get that impression. I think the other thing that we're not talking about here is freight and deliveries with the rise in online shopping. And actually, I think 40% of the morning rush traffic in Westminster is commercial traffic. It's vans and HGVs, and we've got to look at why they're there and whether they need to be, and whether we can consolidate it, and look at things like cargo bikes for that last mile. And yeah, again, the original question, it is down to the physical nature of the different boroughs. The inner city has just massive competition for space on the street side. Doctor cycle bays, trees, e-scooter bays, car club bays, electric charging bays are all fighting for the space that is, proudly kept as parking at the moment. Anyway, there you go.
Thanks,
briefly.
Jim. Caroline, quickly, and then we'll just come to Philip to finish.
Yeah, and I'd mentioned some of it in my words at the end about outer London boroughs and their public transport, but some of it is local politics. It is a decision of the local borough administrations. And I guess it's for campaigners to campaign to change that if they want to. But there are some boroughs who have a very pro-car administration, and that's their standpoint. And that's democracy. We may like it or not, but that is something that's in the mix. But I just wanted to pick up on the issue of capacity reviews. Sharma, you mentioned about bus capacity review. The reviews that are being asked for on capacity by government as part of the latest TfL deal, looking at buses and then looking at trains and tubes, This is about potentially reducing the frequency of our public transport. If you reduce the frequency, more people will turn to things like cars because it's not a reliable turn up and go service. And you see that there are still parts of London the train companies are running a reduced frequency of trains. Worcester Park has had its train service halved. It's once every half an hour. That's going to make you think maybe I'll take the car rather than use the train. We've got to stop that potential cut to public transport because that will have the reverse effect of all the work that's been going on in the boroughs around healthy streets.
Thanks, Caroline. So finally, Philip, boroughs are different, but politicians matter.
I agree with you too. I think absolutely agree with you in that you can, and I'm not going to name boroughs, you can see places that are similar geographies, similar demographics that have very different approaches. So I do think, you know, leadership matters, but then so also there's the civic society underneath that and what people have been focusing on. And these things do take a long time, actually. We've just been celebrating what we've achieved in the last 15 months all across the city. And I've seen some amazing streetscape changes in Conservative boroughs like Westminster and Wandsworth, as much as other places as well. But, you know, the school streets movement in London started in 2015, and Sharma said 2 school streets for the last 15 months. We had 5 up to the sort of 2016 moment. So the coalitions that have sort of built and had those conversations at school gates, in TRA meetings, this is a long haul effort, and you can praise that, you know, the Hackneys or the Waltham Forests or others, but it's a decade's worth of work to get to the point where you can suddenly go from 5 to 40 and take people with you. And I think my remarks at the very end, you know, officers are tired, civic society is tired, the capacity of residents to take change is really challenging. So we've got to remain ambitious, but recognise there are a lot of headwinds against us, and how do we tackle the funding ones, the co-production ones, the where next ones, and take as many Londoners with us as well. And that is the same for inner and outer London. I just think this is why this is so important, because this dialogue continues, and I'm really pleased to hear the work on equalities and buses joining the scorecard, because I think that will also help some of the debates that take place sort of beyond this Zoom out on social media, and they're taking place right now from what I can see as well.
Okay, thanks so much, Philip, and that's going to have to be it for now. So just wanted to say, you know, that I think that idea that we're all tired is true, but also we're all very excited, and we have to collectively retain our morale to keep fighting. So on that note, I just want to say that, you know, it's been an incredible year, and life is different. My life is certainly different this year than it was this time last year, and for that I am extremely grateful. So thanks everybody, not just for coming along to talk, but for attending and for everything that you do. And we'll hopefully see you again this time next year. And we will, so we're going to try to answer the questions that are left in due course. So you will be hearing from us over the next few days. So thanks very much to everybody, and goodbye.